to the next in our speaker series, Islands of History, Insularity, Connectivity, and the Island Experience, generously funded by Brown's Graduate International Colloquium Fund. Today is my considerable pleasure to welcome Professor Christy Konstantakapoulou, Senior Lecturer at the University of London, Birkbeck. Christy received an MA from UCL in 1996 in Ancient History, and then her doctorate in the same discipline from Oxford in 2002. Many of us, of course, know her from her seminal work, The Dance of the Islands, Insularity, Networks in the Athenian Empire and the Aegean World, which has certainly been very influential for me in my work. She also has a book with Katerina Panagopoulou entitled Greek and Roman Networks in the Mediterranean. She's currently working on her next book, which explores insularity and island history in the Hellenistic period, particularly networks of interaction around Delos in the 3rd century BCE. And it is on this subject that she'll be speaking to us this evening with a talk entitled Insularity and Epigraphy, the Case of 3rd Century Delos. Please join me in welcoming Professor Konstantakapoulou.
So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to come here, and I've had a tremendous day meeting students and staff and old friends, so thank you very much. I'm really enjoying the experience. I hope you enjoy some of the things I'm going to talk about. So here it is. This is always my starting point, which is the unique landscape of the Aegean Sea. And famously, Fernand Braudel said, we've explored the whole world, there is no other sea like the Mediterranean. And I would say we've explored the whole world, and this is truly unique. And this is, the heart of what interests me, which is what makes the Aegean such a fascinating place is exactly the presence of so many islands. And this is kind of truisms in this particular context, but this issue of mutual visibility between islands, of course, facilitated navigation from a very early stage. And this kind of mutual visibility and the omnipresence of islands also affected the ways ancient Greeks viewed the Aegean. And this is a much later source than what I'm interested in. It's Aelius Aristides' Hymn to the Aegean, is second sophistic. And I've put some it's prose, which is fascinating that he's writing this kind of stuff in prose rather than the more traditional version of poetry. But this, for me, being a Greek myself, is a fascinating bit of conceptualization of the Aegean. Look at the first passage that I've put. And it says the Aegean is not barren, nor by opening an endless vista does it cause depression and despair. And I thought, this is exactly it. So I moved to Britain from Greece, as a 20-something-year-old, and I'm used to the Aegean, I'm used to the presence of the sea, and I go to Britain, and there is the Irish Sea, and people say, look at the beauty. And I feel despair and depression, because if you come from the background of this geographical experience, the endless grey sea of the Northern Sea and the Irish Sea is truly depressing. And Aelius Aristides, I think, really captured that essence of the islands in the middle of the sea being at the heart of how the Greeks understood the sea. And this is another famous passage. He talks about the islands being a chorus, and that gave the title to my first book, The Dance of the Islands, exactly because it's the idea of coming together and dancing in the circle. Of course, he was not the only one who spoke about the dance of the island, or rather that is a recurrent theme in ancient Greek literature. And this is, as the heaven is adorned with stars, so too the Aegean Sea is adorned with islands. It's indeed a hymn, a celebration of what the Aegean is. So this is it. The Aegean, the presence of islands, it's at the heart of the ancient understandings of the sea. And when we looking at size of islands, I have argued, and I think this is the case for the Aegean, it's small, that what makes an island in the Greek ancient mentality is partly its small size. And this is a picture of Delos, a very small island indeed. And the concept of the small island does affect ancient Greek perception of insularity. So here it is, a very small island, Delos, at the heart of the southern Aegean, giving its name to the Cyclades, because they're circling Delos around in this dance, and these are some of the sources from various periods that talk about the idea of the dance with Delos as its center. And although it's a small island, it is, as birthplace of the twin gods of Apollo and Artemis, it is at the conceptual center of the Aegean and of the islands on a mythical and religious level. And because of its central location, both geographically and in terms of mythical and religious narratives, it does occupy this kind of central space in the religious collective imaginary of the Greeks. So this is a background on Delos. What I have been working and finishing the book right now, it's the history of Delos in the 3rd century. And that is a period of Delian independence. Now, Delos, because it's a small island and because it has such an particular importance in religion and myth, it attracted the interest from a very early on from outside the island community. So this is, I just put one example, this is a famous Terrace of the Lions. It's an Axian artistic piece of work. It's quite unique in the Greek world to have a series of monumental lions framing what perhaps was one of the entrances to the sanctuary from the older northern port. That has been debated, but I really can't see what else that's doing over there. But this is, this is one of the examples of investment from outside the island of a powerful island in the period, 6th century Naxos, as elements of projecting prestige and power and superiority in the religious arena of the sanctuary. And this investment from outside sources in order to create a conspicuous position within Delos, it's what characterizes Delos throughout its history. In the 5th century, Delos, of course, becomes part of the Athenian Empire, and indeed it is the headquarters of what we call the Delian League, which essentially transforms in the Athenian Empire. And during the 5th century and during the Athenian Empire, the Delos and its most important asset, the sanctuary, is controlled by a board of Athenian officials, which are called amphictyons, which is quite a bizarre term considering they are Athenian officials, and they basically control the island. The period of Athenian control of the sanctuary ends in 314, when the Delians finally gain their independence, and that brings us to the period I'm looking at, 314 to 166. That's a period of the Delians' independence, where you see a number of developments taking place in sanctuary. And to put it at the end, in 116, the nasty Romans come in, expel the Delian population, install Athenian clerus, and that's the end of the Delian experiment. To look now, as I said, I'm focused on the period of independence, but to look, further, and this is a kind of aerial shot of Delos, to look further in the Roman period, of course, this is one of the most famous quotes associated with the history of the island, how Delos became the most important slave market in the Eastern Mediterranean. When Strabo talks about it in the Roman period, he's talking about 10,000 slaves being sold and bought and sold on a daily basis. People have argued, I'm not working on that, do not ask me, that this is an exaggeration. If 10,000 is an exaggeration, well, maybe, it still gives us an indication of what an ancient audience would perceive as a reasonable number. So we are looking at one of the biggest slave markets, and therefore we're looking at one of the biggest kind of centers for economic transactions in the Eastern Mediterranean in the Roman period. And that has consequences in how the island is transformed, because if you're having this kind of traffic generated, then you would expect investments in infrastructure, in terms of commerce, religion, and political functions. And indeed, if you look back at the Hellenistic period, you do get a sense of a massively expanding population. This is a Quartier du Théâtre, and it's a housing area again of late Hellenistic Roman Delos, and it gives you an indication of what kind of populations we're looking at for this very small island. The estimates differ. So people have argued that in the period of independence, you're looking at 1,200 Delian citizens, adult male citizens, which gives us a population of at least 10,000 inhabitants at the same time. It's kind of maximum capacity. So here it is. If you see a small island that has such a central position, mythical and religious networks, that has an important sanctuary with a huge regional catchment area and quite a large population. How does this work? And this is one of my starting points. This is a fragment of the poet Crito in the so-called Busybody, of which comedy, Lost Comedy, we only have this passage. And he talks about the busybody, Philopragman. And he says, he made the Phoenician ship owner who controlled a large purse give up his voyage and force him to sail, perhaps, 2 ships. He wanted to leave Piraeus and go to Delos because he heard that this appears to be the only place in the world that has 3 good features for a parasite. A marketplace full of fine food. The word is evopson, which means fish. And fish, perhaps, is particularly important for the concept of the parasite. It's not just fine food, but it's fish and a market of fish. Second item, a population that was squandering, and the Delians themselves who are parasites of the god. And that's where I thought, what does that mean? Why are the Delians the parasites of the god? Well, the Delians, if you look at we had a discussion in the workshop about this, about kind of ancient Greek ideals, or actually ancient elite ideals of self-sufficiency that cannot in any way be self-sufficient. Extensive work has been done on Delos beyond the sanctuary. That's a shot of the south of the island. You can see the kind of terraces that walls that divide the island. A lot of work has been done by the French school about agricultural uses of space, and they have shown that quite a lot of Delos was used and cultivated in enclosed gardens and for pastoralism, again in enclosed spaces, because you can't just let goats roam free on the territory. They will eat everything. So it did have a certain degree of agricultural produce, but it certainly could not support a population of around 10,000, and the kind of activities, religious activities, that the sanctuary did, and we know that quite well from the epigraphic evidence, in order to survive. Wood, for example, you need a lot of wood to burn for the kind of activities. So it certainly was not self-sufficient as such. And indeed, one of the earliest narratives we have about Delos is this. It's the Homeric hymn to Apollo. Debate when and how and its relationship between the Delian Apollo and the Pythian Apollo. But if we just say, oh, okay, I actually don't care, 6th century, that's where I'm going to go. It's 6th century text, and it gives you a snapshot of how a 6th century audience views mythical Delos. So the narrative is the pregnant Leto is looking for a place to give birth to Apollo and Artemis, the twin gods, and all the places reject her, and she reaches Delos and she says, please accept me. No other will touch you as you will find, and I think you will never be rich in oxen and sheep, nor bear vintage, not yet produce plants abundantly, but if you have the temple of far-shooting Apollo, all men will bring you hecatombs and gather here, and incessant savor of rich sacrifice will always arise, and we will feed those who dwell in you from the hand of strangers. For truly your own soil is not rich. This is the early version of the Delian parasite. It's a land that is barren, and it can support its population because of the presence of the hecatombs, of the gifts that other people bring in order to join in honoring Apollo. And if this is quite interesting, because if you have the mythical narratives of the god going and transforming a place, it could have said, and God, will come and be born on your place and transform you into a rich island. It doesn't say that. It says you will never be rich. You will never be transformed through the grace of the god. Rather, the grace of the god is going to make you the parasite in the later sources. It's a different narrative, but it's the same crucial image. And if that is 6th century or earlier, then this kind of image, this kind of, I would say, underlying reality that is reflected in that is then being carried down to the negative image of the parasite that we just saw in the 3rd century comedy. So this is my starting point. If the Delians are parasites and Delos is barren, then who are these people that come and transform the island and make the population able to support itself? I wanted to find a way of quantifying that. the parasite, the stories about the barrenness, quantifying who are the people that come into the island, sharing into this, image of the glorious Apollo as is presented here in the Homeric hymn. And I wanted to see who they are, where they come from, what gender they are, whether they're men or women, and what class they are, if we can talk about that. And to answer that question, which is at the heart of what my project was about, who are the people who come to Delos, the only place we can look at, for me, is epigraphy. And here it is that epigraphy, like so many other places, I'll go back, comes to our rescue. So Delos is a fascinating place because it's the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, but also it's a fascinating place because it's one of the places in the Greek world that produces a lot of inscriptions. This may be related to the fact that Delos is under Athenian control in the classical period, and perhaps the production of inscriptions can be linked to concerns that are linked with what's happening in Athens, which is the development of radical democracy, so accountability and transparency and so on, may be behind the production of inscriptions on Delos too. But actually, for me, for the 3rd century, none of that matters anymore, because at that point, the Delians gain their independence, and they continue the epigraphic production. In other words, whatever kick-started the habit to begin with, at the 3rd century, it no longer matters. But what matters is the Delians take the conscious decision and they produce epigraphically a lot of texts. So what I want to do in the next kind of half an hour or so is look at 2 sets of documents that, for me, give an answer to these questions of who are the people that come to Delos and what do they do. And there are 2 sets of documents. The first is inventories, I'm going to talk about them, and the second is proxeny decrees and other honorific decrees, which is again one of the kind of typical inscriptions produced by the Greek states in the Hellenistic period. So let's start with inventories. Here is a photo. You cannot read anything, and that's part of the exercise. This is a photo of one of the 4 complete inventories we have in the 3rd century from the year 250. So as you can see, inventories are produced on Delos on big slabs of stone. That height is about 2 meters tall. The letters are about this big. You cannot read it, no one can. And they are produced on the island on an annual basis. So every year, the hieropoi, who are the administrators of the island, and there are Delian officials under the independence, go and record on big slabs of stone the treasures kept in the Delian treasuries. So this is the inventory. I should say here that what we see on Delos, the annual publication of inventories, is incredibly rare in the Greek world. And this may be linked with issues of Athens, because Athens is one of the places that they do that, but I don't think it's just that, and I'm going to return to that. What the inventories do is that they give us an incredible wealth of information. So you have the name of the object, they say in the temple, or in this treasury, there's this object, right? And then it will give you a combination of this material, of the other pieces of information. No object has all of this. You just, in some cases, I would say actually 2/3 of those, you just have the name of the object with no other information attached. But once you move beyond, then you have the name of the dedicant, the patronymic, the ethnic, the description, sometimes with the weight, the material. It's normally precious material, so the inventories are interested in recording precious items. They're not interested in other items. It might include the state of preservation and inscriptions of the objects itself. This is for Artemis, this is of Apollo, for Apollo, and so on. Sometimes the location within the temple, as you go in on the left, if you move in the second room on the right, and so on. The deity to whom it's dedicated, and sometimes the purpose of the dedication, right? So this is, you get a lot of information. And this is one, just to give you an idea of what I did when I read all kind of hundreds of inventories, a lot of them fragmentary. This is like one of the more interesting, I should say, objects. Read it and weep. So here it is. all the crowns, there are this many, and then there is a golden necklace, and then it starts, and this is an interesting bit, about the dedications of Queen Stratoniki, and it keeps repeating, daughter of King Demetrius, dedicated, something 109. 3 crowns for the statues of Harites, again, Queen Stratoniki, daughter, dedicated. And then, what is it, a necklace with 48 discs, in case you wondered, that's the weight, and then a golden ring, and with weight, and then the golden fialae with precious stones, and a golden ring with Nike, and what else is, 20 shields made out of onyx, attached on the wall, so in case you where they are attached, golden chains, and a Heraclean quiver, and so on, and it goes, and this is one of my favorite, because that is a unique word in Greek. Fly swats, not any fly swats, 3 handles, one from ivory, one from gold, and the other from onyx. And that always brings me in mind how gods have, cult epithets. There is a fantastic cult epithet for Zeus, Zeus apomios, Zeus the averter of flies. So you sit there in the summer, all these flies are coming there. You give a little prayer, moving your fancy, fly swats, and obviously the flies goes away. So here it is. This is the kind of data set I'm working with. What do you do with this? Well, if you really wanted to know how many, discs the necklace of Stratoniki had, there's the answer, is 48. But it's an incredible wealth of information that is very difficult to quantify. And I won't go into that. I'm very happy. I'm really very happy, because I spent 2 years of my life on this to talk about the problems with this. But the problems are quite severe in terms of fragmentation. What does this source of information actually tell us, and how can we quantify it? And indeed, because those problems are so great, scholars, which are mostly the French scholars who have published this and work on the island, because Delos is excavated by the French School of Athens, scholars have mostly stayed away from discussing this text in any kind of social context, which is what I wanted to do. I wanted to do, which is to look at who are these people, where they come from, and what does that tell us about life and society on Delos. Rather, the debate about inventories has centered on what I would largely call purpose. So why do the Delians, or indeed other people, but let's focus on the Delians, why do they inscribe this annually on stone when it's so expensive to do that? And we know that because the Delian accounts tell us how expensive this is. So people have looked at in terms of purpose. They looked at symbolic purpose and practical purpose. And this, quite a well-defined debate about symbolic versus practical. Now, I have many problems with that. One of my main problems is that what is symbolic, or rather, what is not symbolic? What does that doesn't explain anything. So I wanted to move away from the debate about the purpose of inventories, and rather, if not, overcome, I would say overcome, just leave the debate behind, but perhaps combine it in a meaningful way, and to look at these documents as basically constructive elements of a community of worship that is produced by the Delians for audiences. In other words, the Delians are projecting to their audiences, and I'll come back to that, what they think is the glory of the sanctuary. And the glory of the sanctuary is all these people, famous people that celebrate, and that's why Queen Stratoniki, daughter of Demetrius, of King Demetrius, is repeated, that dedicate these fantastic, spectacular, wealthy objects. And you don't need to read these inventories to get the sense. You just need to glimpse at the huge slabs of stone all around the sanctuary to get a sense. Look at the objects, because you can't look at the objects. It's not a museum. They're inside, locked under lock and key. But you get a sense of look at the people. So if they're interested in constructing a community of worship, then they're looking at the audiences. We're looking at audiences. So who are the audiences for that? The primary audience is the deities, is the gods. They're the ones who, get a sense of how important they are. But also, we have to look at multiple audiences, because it's also the audience about the Delians themselves. This is backlinked with the issues of accountability and transparency and democratic procedures. In other words, the Delians are making sure, the Board of Administrators, that they are giving to the next annual Board of Administrators everything they have received. they don't want to be held accountable. We have a nice little snapshot where in 1 year it says, and of those tiles that the previous board they said they gave to us, we didn't receive. Otherwise, do not hold us accountable for things that got lost in transition. So accountability and transparency is part of their concern. But also they are concerned into projecting, not just to the divine audience, not just to the Delian communal audience, that is the one that these people are accountable to, but also to the community of worshippers, the people that come to the island. And they're engaging in the act of dedication or whatever it is that they do. They do multiple things to show them how brilliant the sanctuary is. So this is a story of dedications. This is a story of the community of worshippers. It's a story of the dedications enacted. And it's the adaptive communications of the gods. So it's multiple audiences. The primary audience is the Delian gods, but also these stories, these dedications also show communication between individuals and their communities and between individuals between themselves. And there are multiple audiences that we have to think, and they are not mutually exclusive. And also the temporal dimension of these documents. I think there are three temporal elements that are also existing parallel in the heart of this text. These are documents of past actions. In other words, people came in the sanctuary, dedicated something to the god, and then this gets transcribed onto an inventory later on. So it is about past, but it's also about present and future. This is also a testament to the present state of the sanctuary. It says, this is what we have here and now. It's a present attestation of the glory of the god. But it's also a future dimension, I think, implied in there. And this is particularly relevant when we're looking at the dedication of Phialae, which is, you could say, the quintessential dedication of the Delian sanctuary. As long as a sanctuary exists, then annual dedications of Phialae are going to take place. And that means this gives you a point to the future. It's the beginning, it's a past action, it's a present state, but it's the beginning, the starting point for future actions. So taking this into account, the multiple audiences that are implied, the multiple temporal dimensions that are included here, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to look at what the inventories tell us about the people who came to Delos. And my primary interest, but then it became almost secondary by the end, I finished with in primary, the original question I had is the geography of distance. In other words, where do these people come from? So how do I do that? I looked at the names who had an ethnic attached, and if they have an ethnic, I just assume this is the ethnic these people had, and then put it on the map or in the database. In some cases, the inventories themselves didn't have an ethnic, but from other sources we knew where this person came from. So I did that. And I created a kind of map of where these people come from. And this is one of the first results. So in some ways, it sounds surprising, but it's the first time anyone has quantified the inventories to produce this kind of results. So if you look at names, so who are these people, you can see the largest chunk is what I said, people from Delos and people from the neighboring islands. And there are, the 30%, 29% that we could not establish. But if you actually look at the number of dedications, because you have people producing numerous dedications, then Delos becomes the largest chunk, and what I call the non-Aegean region, which is mostly, it's kind of Magna Graecia and the Black Sea, and of course Alexandria. And if you think of the importance of the Ptolemies, you see how that enters. Here it is, the non-Aegean region produces more dedications I would expect. That's partly, the Ptolemaic and Queen Stratonici dedication. So the inventories give us a snapshot of who are these people and where they come from, and it gives you, it's not the whole image of what kind of religious activity is happening at the sanctuary, because of course the people who go to Delos, the inventories reflect the people who go to Delos and then make a dedication which is prestigious enough to end up being recorded in the inventories. That doesn't record all the people that come to Delos for a variety of reasons, not just, of course, religious, but political, economic, and the other. In fact, when I'm going to talk about the honorific degrees, one of my main issues, and this is not just me, but everyone who talks about honorific degrees, is that perhaps separating what we call political from economic from religious is fundamentally and methodologically unsound. You cannot do that unless the text itself allows you, as we shall see in just a moment. So taking into account that this is just a snapshot of religious activity that's taking place, what do we see? Large presence of Delians with similar distribution of neighboring islands, that is the islands of the southern Aegean, then, the Aegean cities and the non-Aegean, which is Alexandria, Sicily, Black Sea, Cyprus, and Phoenicia. Now, can we, break it down further? An easiest thing, easier said than done, is to look at gender. Because you can tell, with the exception of out of, hundreds of names, only 2 that I couldn't ascribe a gender to, and feel free to have guesses. I really cannot say what gender they are. You could look at female names and male names. So what can you do with that? One of the most important conclusions is that compared to male names, where we cannot establish the 23%, female names are not established in 37%. In other words, it is much less likely for inventories to record where a woman comes from than to record where a man comes from. And I think that is linked with the idea of the inventories as enhancing prestige for the sanctuary. In other words, women normally, unless they're queens, they're not going to enhance the prestige. Otherwise, and that's why the administrators are not interested in writing down, other than perhaps the name. So you cannot say where they come from as much, but then when it comes down to, you can see the vast majority of Delians and neighboring islands. And indeed, from the neighboring islands, there are from the 3 islands next to Delos, not even the ones that further apart. They are from, if I remember, Naxos, Mykonos, and Paros, the 3 closest islands to Delos. They don't travel much. The non-Aegean, 11%, with the exception of one name, all the other are elite women. There are queens. So again, you get a sense, that's not unsurprising, that when women travel, if they travel from afar, that is non-Aegeans, they're elite, and mostly the women that go are from easy access out of Delos itself or the neighboring islands. So what can we, whereas you see with the male names, again, Delos is mostly where the names come from, but then you get similar distribution between Aegean, non-Aegean, and neighboring islands. It's not the same image as with the female ones. So what can we say with this? Well, Delos had a considerable catchment area. Do I have a map? Yes. That's the map. So the red dots are whatever this thing is. It moves from computer to computer. The blue dots are communal dedications where you have a community. So the Rhodians dedicate X. And that's a blue dots. And the red dots is actually individual dedications. So that's the catchment area. And I'm going to go to the wider Mediterranean, where yellow are the commune dedications, so the Alexandrias, the Biblians, and so on, and the red ones are the individual dedications. So if we go back to that, what can we say? It's a considerable catchment area. It has both male and female participants. It has both individual and collective coming from all over the Aegean and beyond. No single group can claim absolute majority of dedications. But I would say that the majority of the dedications recorded on the inventories is Delos and southern Aegean islands. So even though it's a quite large catchment area, the heart of the sanctuary, as reflected in the dedication, is the Delos and the south in the Aegean. But beyond that, you do get quite, large. It reaches quite far from the Black Sea to the Hellespont, to the Western Greece, Cyprus, Byblos, Phoenicia, and so on. So how do we explain that? Well, we explain that from the fact that Delos attracts, it's kind of, I'm repeating the same, but attracts a number of people from all over the Eastern Mediterranean to dedicate objects, so that's not the only reason, and to worship the gods. But these people come there and they dedicate, but is that the only reason why they come to the island? That the inventories cannot answer, so I looked at my second set of documents. And it's this, it's the proxenate decrees. So like with the inventories where the Delians are truly prolific, the Delians are also prolific with the publication of award of honors to individual honorants. In all cases, as you would expect, are men, because they're honorific decrees, and in all of them, they're outside Delos, because the nature of the honorific decree is to honor someone outside your community. So I looked at the proxenate decrees, which is the biggest set of honorific decrees, but I didn't just look at that. If I wanted to look at the honorific habit, in other words, who does the Delian community deem worthy enough of honors, I looked at, as I said, proxenate decrees, which is a decree offering proxenate. I'll come back to that. But also looked at honorific statues and exedras, and other honors, including crowns, that do not exist as epigraphic stones or as statues or dedications, but appear in the Delian accounts. So in the Delian accounts, where every year they say how much the sanctuary is paying, they said, and this much money for a crown for X, and this much money for a statue for X, for Y. And we don't have the crown or the statue, but we have the attestation. That gives you a total of 567 honors given to individuals and community outside Delos during the period of independence. So how do we look at these documents? This is an entire debate related to honorific habits. I don't want to go into that, but I just chose this. That's a wonderful IG 114598, which is a decree in honor of Pisistratus, son of Argeus, from Chios. And it's very typical in many ways. It calls him Euergetes, a benefactor, and is ordered with proxenate. That is kind of an official position in the other city. It gives him also associated honors at Eleia, exemption from tax, enctasis, right to own land, and prosodus, privileged access to the Council of the Assembly. This is in many ways extremely typical, in the sense that it tells you who they're honoring, it gives you the honorant's name, it tells you what specific honors this guy is getting, but it doesn't tell you anything else. And this is one of the crucial issues of honorific degrees, not just on Delos, but elsewhere. It's very formulaic language. In other words, the kind of information that I want to know is like, what did this guy do to get this kind of honors? We don't know. In, I would say, 9 out of 10 cases, the language is so formulaic that it gives you no additional information. In fact, it's so formulaic that we have one example where the Delians have erased the name of the honorant because they're about to inscribe someone else's name, because it doesn't matter who, it's so formulaic the language that it doesn't matter which name you put. They've all been benefactor and great to the city, and they get all this stuff. So what can we do to that? I should say, and this is drawing up on William Mack's recent work on proxenate, that rather than looking at the formulaic language of the decrees as a hindrance, like, why don't they tell us? We should look at it as a very important factor in how these people perceive their honors. And how they do it is that they take the whole concept of benefaction. This guy obviously did something for the Delians to get the honors. And they take a context that may perhaps have been linked with individual acts, so perhaps he helped some prominent Delian somewhere, and they embed it in a public discourse that effaces individuality and imposes communal honors. In other words, they don't give us the details because they don't want to highlight the individual associations between this person and perhaps some prominent Delians. They want to create a very public context. So what do we do with this type of document? I would say I would want to highlight 4 issues, and remember, I'm suppressing here quite a long discussion. So first of all, we have to take into account, as I said, formulaic language, the lack of details, the interchangeable elements, and so on. Second issue is that normally honors have stress, perpetuity, and familial links. So it says these honors are offered to this guy and all his descendants. And sometimes we get someone honored whose father was previously honored. So they run in families, they try to create links not just with this individual, but with the entire descendants. The honors, always, with the exception of 2 out of 567 cases, include the ethnic. So it's not like the inventories. Why do they include the ethnic? Is because the community of origin, which is what the ethnic designates, matters for this. It matters for the creation of associations the Delians make between themselves and this person. So they're not just honoring this person, but in somehow they're linking it with the community. And that's particularly important because some of these people, some of these guys, are actually resident on Delos and have been resident on Delos for quite a while. And we know that because sometimes they tell us because he's a resident on the island, or because some people, especially a couple of bankers that are being honored, we know from the accounts. They are there doing banking activities for decades before the honors come in. So if they're including the ethnic of this guy, is not just for identification, because perhaps where this guy comes from doesn't matter anymore for who this guy is because he's on Delos, but rather is to create this association between the Delos and the community of origin. The fourth issue, so that was number 3, is that we cannot ascribe any specific context for the honors for this unless the inscription itself tells us. In other words, when people were going to look at the distribution map, look at the cluster of honors, they said, oh, look, these are all these Hellespontian or Black Sea people. That's obviously because of grain trade or of particularly trade importance and so on. And I always thought, this is just fundamentally wrong to make that assumption. Unless the inscription tells you, and it does in very, very few cases, in about 15 out of 567, it gives you a reason as to why they were honored, because they provided grain in a good price is one, because they were a good doctor to the Delians, that's another one, because of the music they wrote for us, that's the third one. Unless they tell us, we cannot make any assumptions. Because this is my other point, and I mentioned it earlier. What is this with the compartmentalization of human activities? In other words, these people come in contact with the Delians, they either reside on the island, or they visit the island, or they're back home, and they do something for the Delians who visit them back home. They do something to the Delians, and they receive the honors. Can we really make a separation between someone who, say, was a doctor, but then had no political position that you want to cultivate through the honors, or someone who gave them a good price but also didn't worship the god, or someone who was a very good benefactor to the sanctuary and worship the god, and then he didn't do something financial? In other words, why do we assume that if you have an important position on politics, then that doesn't include financial transactions, or indeed what I would, put under the cultural life, which is, poets and guitars, guitar players and singers and artists and so on. So unless the decree tells us, we cannot make assumptions about different forms of benefactions and human activity. So in that in mind, what can we say about the Delian spread of honors? This is a list of where the people are honored. Yeah. Where we can tell. And this is the map, right? That's the Aegean map, and that's the Mediterranean one. The first thing we can say is that the geographic spread is immense. I don't have here the Delphi map because I couldn't bear making it, but I will tell you that this is much a wider distribution of honors in the Mediterranean than even Delphi, the primary, Pan-Hellenic sanctuary par excellence, has in terms of proxy degrees. And also, Delphi is also very prolific in the production of proxy degrees. So you can't say, well, they honor them, but they didn't write them down. They produce almost equal numbers of proxy degrees. But this is a much bigger one. It shows, I think, quite well the place that Delos holds in the kind of wider networks of the 3rd century of the Hellenistic age. So we know Delos is a display, is a primary arena for the display of piety and power of prominent individuals. If you want to show off for your community, your position is, say, in the court of the Hellenistic kings, that's where you go and set up a statue. And we know that if you want to show off that you are the best king of all the Hellenistic kings in the mess, the sandpit that is the Hellenistic Aegean in the 3rd centuries with 3-year-olds fighting over the whatever toy they're playing at. That's pretty much 3rd century for you. If you are the Hellenistic king, that's where Delos is one of the places where you're going to go and do something great, and then you're going to get some kind of honor. So that is reflected onto the geographic spread. Within the geographic spread, we do see clusters, right? And you could see some clusters in the Syro-Palestinian coast, in the entrance of the Hellespont. What else have I written down? I can't even read, and so on. But even so, you can see clusters. Again, the heart is the southern Aegean and the coast, and the Asia Minor coast. It's similar to the inventory's map. Third conclusion, we cannot, I think, interpret the spread of honors or indeed the honorific habit through any specific interpretation of, say, political patterns and relations. So, for example, 2 French scholars, Vial and Bazlet, who have done work on the honorific habit, they looked at the specific decrees and they've explained them through what they called interstate relations, in other words, prominent individuals, and then they date them with specific events that are linked with Hellenistic history. I think that is absolutely wrong methodologically. Even if you can do that for the handful of honorants whom you know from other sources that were key players in the kind of interpolitics transactions that took place in the 3rd century, the vast majority of honorants are completely unknown. So we can't place them, and you can't take what I think is the exception and impose it over the whole of the corpus. Fourth, what we can say is that when the decrees themselves give us a narrative about why they're honoring these people, the overwhelming issue seems to be power, access to power, and facilitation of access to power. So they honor individuals for easing access to the courts of the Hellenistic kings or to providing accommodation for Delians who are staying in another city and so on. That is, the Delians are not alone in doing that. That is one of the things that the Hellenistic world does in the 3rd century, but it's one of the few things that we can actually say in terms of the motivation behind the decrees. And final issue, publication. As I said, Delos is one of the most prolific publishers of honorific decrees. And I should say that the assembly normally decides to award honors, then the publication of the decrees in the form of inscription is an additional step in the honors. So why do the Delians produce epigraphically so many decrees? I think this is back to the fact that Delos is a very small island where the most important factor, that the most important asset they have is a sanctuary, and it's the same with the inventories. So this is where insularity comes into. In other words, there's not much of Delos if you take the sanctuary. Delos is a sanctuary, sanctuary is Delos. The fact that the Delians have this sanctuary creates a nexus of communication that they then build and use and develop to become what in the Roman time becomes the biggest slave market in the world. That's just one aspect of their economic power and networking. That's what they have. That's the capital. It's back to them being the parasites of the god. What I started with, it's back to Delos being a barren place. What they have, the one access, the one resource they have is a sanctuary. And they're using that to create a position for themselves in the world. And how are you going to do that? One of the ways of doing that is advertising to your audience, which is this, and the wider Mediterranean, how great you are. So you publish the inventory list, you show how great it is, how many important things are coming. You publish your proximate degrees, again showcasing how great you are and how linked with all these individuals, with all other individuals is, how well connected you are with all these other individuals. So for me, this is the interesting thing, because in the 3rd century, Delos, if you look at literary sources, I mean, I put Diodorus, I put Strabo and put a couple of other stuff. You know, there's not much on Delos. If you just looked at the literary sources, you couldn't write a history of 3rd century Delos, and you couldn't certainly explain why it's such a huge place in terms of housing and population in the Hellenistic period. But rather, by looking at descriptions, you get a glimpse of what kind of resources a small island community had and what they did with them to create a space for themselves in the changing landscape, in the changing kind of patterns of communication that is the 3rd century Aegean, where the Greek world of the polis is beginning to collapse, and you have the constant struggle for control of this space between the Hellenistic kings, between Ptolemies, Antigonids, and so on. And I think by looking at the networks of interaction recorded in the inventories and the honorific degrees, you get a sense of who are these people that are coming to the island. The proximate degrees and the honorific degrees, they haven't necessarily been to the island, all of them, but they have come to in contact with Delos. So you get a sense of different groups of people from different places and their association. And this kind of appeal, this kind of reaching out to the world is what I understand as regionalism, and what is, I think, is at the heart of the Southern Aegean. And this is what I want to, this is what I want to end up with, because we're living in very, very peculiar times. We're witnessing the largest population of movement of human population in modern times. And this is going through the Greek islands. So for me, this is the thing. Here is the image of the ancient world. Not that it's all happy and rosy, they still kept killing each other and had slavery and whatnot. But it's an image of the world where the sea brings together people, connects people, creates opportunities for connection. And we're in the world where suddenly we decide to draw lines and cross boundaries. And as humans, right now as we're speaking, the EU is drawing the lines and creating the boundaries and stopping the biggest population movement take place. We, as humans, can disregard the boundaries, can object to all that, refuse profit, imperialism, propaganda, inconceived notions of security, and say, move. This is open space. Move along. Thank you.
We have time for a couple questions, I think.
Thank you. That was a great talk.
Oh, thank you.
And these documents, these inventories, I have a question about them. I have a bunch, but I'll just ask maybe one, maybe two, just because they're so interesting. So I wonder whether all the people, we talked about them coming to make dedications, is there any indication that some of them didn't come?
Yeah.
Dedications were sent? And does this maybe account for some variability, maybe in the genders or in the different regions that are represented?
Yeah, we don't know. Well, you know, there are some we know. So, for example, when we look at the dedication of Fialae, that is silver Fialae, normally being a dedication of the result of an annual sacrifice performed by a community delegation, and that's why it's designated by the plural of the ethnic, the Rhodians, the Naxians, right? They send, and they say the Rhodians via Architheoros, the chief pilgrim, made these dedications. So in that case, you can say these people actually came. They send, they send a delegation. Here is the name of the delegations, and they represent the community. When it comes to the women, for example, I don't know. I mean, but for me, it is an indication that this is actually people that actually went there. And why? Because as I said, if you look at the names and the non-Aegean, the longest distance, only one out of those names is not a queen. I think the queens, okay, if they have not gone there, or perhaps they sent somewhere, but the fact that you don't have other names, it means that they didn't just send someone, that you will never know. And this is one of the problems with the dedications, and why people have argued you can't do social history with them, because can you make the assumptions they went there? No, you cannot in all cases, but I think you could yes, you could in some cases. So what does that tell me? Even if I don't want to go down the route and say these are actually people who went there, is that this gives me a hint that women had considerable access to some resources, because as I said, the inventories only record precious objects, gold, silver, ivory, and so on. It's not that they were rich, but they had access to this object and the choice to dispose of them in their particular context. So that tells me something about female agency, for example, that I wouldn't necessarily get from somewhere else. What the inventories do not record is everyday objects. That you get in different sets of inventories. Browron, for example, and there's work done on Browron catalogs, are concerned, because of the particular type of deity, with female clothing and people, dresses worn in women in childcare. No clothing in the Delian inventories, just precious objects. So that is women having agency and dedicated. Whether they've been there, I think they did. I think they did. Yeah.
So Delos is a place where Hellenistic queens you might go to Delos.
Oh yeah, I mean, we know Stratoniki went to Delos, and I mean, you get this is one of the problems of 3rd century history, right? You don't have the narrative framework of the events, and that's why Graham will kill me. Hellenistic history in some ways is so boring, because people just try to figure out what happened when. Aegean history. So I did my undergraduate degree in Athens, and my professor was Kostas Bourazelis, brilliant guy. He was really, really into political history. Good for him. We spent a whole term discussing essentially 3 battles: the battles of Kos, the battles of Amorgos, and I can't remember the third one. It's all gone like that. There are no references, so there's huge debate. Battle of Andros was then. No, it was 20 years later. We know they're important. We don't even know who won them or where that happened. So a lot of Hellenistic history is like, when did this happen and why? And because you cannot sort out the narrative framework, then, how the hell are you going to do that? So I'm just, flying above all this and say, I don't care, it doesn't affect me. I'm just going to look at the 3rd century as a chunk. And it doesn't matter where Battle of Amorgos or Kos took place. Somewhere in the 260s, I'll say that it's 260s rather than 280s. Who cares? Because it doesn't affect that. So this is a problem. If you're working with a lack of narrative, how do you work with this kind of text? I forgot what you asked. And that's
I was asking about whether people actually came, and I think that's awesome, the idea that you have these almost Athenian tribute list type lists that queens and kings and stuff are wandering around.
So I remember. So in very few little stuff that we have from essentially very fragmentary Diodorus and Livy and whatnot, is that occasionally you get, in Queen Stratoniki visited Delos, or you can reconstruct it, but it's very, very little to go with. And in fact, one of the stuff that the invaders have been using quite successfully is as ways of reconstructing political history. So because you have for the Hellenistic kings and queens the titles, and you can see how Queen Stratoniki starts being called Queen Stratoniki, and the dating of the inventory is quite secure, because you have the Delian archons and you have quite secure lists of how it works out, and the French have been brilliant in sorting that out. Then you can see Queen Stratoniki is called queen in this list, but not in that list. So you can put the kind of accession or whatever you want to do in relation to that. So political history, the inventories have been used. The other place where they have been used is for archaeology. So I'm reading the inventories, and I come, it's like names of objects, and I'm like, oh, my Greek is really shit. I mean, I don't know these words. So I open the little Scott, and it's like, yeah, I don't know this word because it's Hapax Delian inventories, right? And there's like 35 words, I kid you not, 35 words, and the translation is type of cup. Help me, people. I mean, they obviously knew what they were talking about, right? So they say this, and they knew that the kavasa is not vatiaki, right? What are these things? Type of cup. And so a lot of it has been done into kind of identifying pottery shapes along the names of the inventory list. Good for the archaeologists. I don't care. The other thing that, I should say is that, so you get a sense of, I say female agency, you get a sense of female traveling distance. The other thing that you get is that you do not get gender objects, which you can't get in other inventories. Women dedicate exactly the same types of objects as men. Women dedicate jewelry, men dedicate jewelry. Women dedicate crowns, queens and kings and queens. Women dedicate weaponry, men dedicate weaponry. It's not gender object, which is fascinating. Also, in terms of percentages, and that's why I think, the gender issue, and I'm not even, I didn't even think I was interested in gender history when I started this, is that these inventories are almost 3 times, or in terms of names dedicating, it's 3 times more than Athenian inventories. So it's either it includes more women dedicating, or they're more interested in recording women than the Athenian inventories are. And that's fascinating, because the only work on inventories is really the Athenian stuff. That's the only parallel we have. This stuff, the French won't touch social history in that respect. Good for me. But, so you find all that. Yeah, sorry.
Are you able to tease out the an approximate absolute number of the dedicants? I know you've got approximate.
Yes, okay. All right, it's fragmentation, right? So they record them manually. We have 4 complete lists. We have about 75 inscriptions, so there are about 25 inscriptions missing, but some of them are very small. So if I remember correctly, this is sometime I did, about you can use stuff for about 35 years. My total number of names is about 450, but that is like 1/3 of the actual objects dedicated. So yeah, that's it.
Also, do you have chronological overlap with your 2 different categories of inscriptions?
So the other thing that happens is that this is also a work in progress for them. So the inventories, we really have good inventories for the period of independence, but we have some inventories for the Athenian control, but they're not very good. They're very few and they're very fragmentary. So they're obviously continuing in Athenian practice, but they really take it and do it on their own. They really, take the habit and do something with it. And I think that has to do with Delian pride and projecting their sense of the world to their community of worshippers, I would say, to whoever comes to the island. And there you see, in the earliest inventories, you just have kind of in this temple and in that temple, or just randomly. In the later inventories, you have a chronological sequence. So they say, and this is what we got from the previous board, and this is what we got in this year. So it's like a large chunk, then a small chunk. And then once it goes down, you can also map it one on top of the other. And that's fascinating back to the political history, because when it comes to the Fialae, the dedications, then when the Fialae are linked with specific festivals, such as the festival of the Ptolemai or the festival of the Antigonia and the Demetria, then you can work backwards and see when these festivals were instigated. And for Hellenistic history, we all jump up in joy, because that's one of the few chronological anchors you have for a whole series of events. It doesn't solve the problems, because there's about 5 different Ptolemaic being celebrated on the island from different groups of people. So when it says, and this Fialae from the Ptolemaic, good luck figuring out what that is. But at least it gives you an anchor in the terms of sequence and events that you can map on and figure it out. Yeah.
Just one more.
Is it known when the sanctuary was first built, and does this dedication go back before Hellenistic times to the origins of the sanctuary?
The sanctuary, if you're talking monumentalization, the first building is early 7th. But that's just monumentalization. I mean, what we're looking here is a much more expansion of practice. So I'm looking at the 3rd century. These record the 3rd century state of treasury. Some of them are quite old. So you have Spartan generals, liberation of Delos from the Athenians in 403. You have, I love this, so I'm going to impose this on you. You have this guy, Amenondas, right? Who is Amenondas? Someone. So you know who Amenondas becomes later on in the 3rd century. So he's Amenondas in the earliest, becomes Epaminondas later on. Because of course Epaminondas is a famous Theban general. If you just have some random Amenondas there, it's not going to enhance your sanctuary's fame. But if you make him into Epaminondas, so it does, kind of link into earlier stuff. But you really get the snapshot of the 3rd century, even though some of the dedications are obviously predating the 3rd. Yeah.
Just one final question. So a very fragile, impressionable young academics here.
Oh
So
God, here comes.
In defense of history,
I knew it.
Well, that's all the time we have.
Go
And
on.
I'm very happy with social history, that's not a problem. But, of course, the history is important. And for the Proxeny inscriptions, you talk about the city ethnics. And of course, that doesn't necessarily always tie in with the city from which these people are actually really actively operating.
You're right.
So of course, it's a little bit kind of like deceptive to have these distribution maps with city ethnics, as you know well. But if we do re-inject some history, then we can talk about some of these individuals about which we know something, although there are obviously difficulties with chronology. So for instance, when Callias, son of Thymochares, Stetos, gets Proxeny, or Sostratos, son of Dexiphanes, and Cleodos gets Proxeny, we know that these are two individuals who, in the first half of the 3rd century, are very prominent in Ptolemaic circles.
Yeah.
And you yourself know very well all about the League of the Islanders since you write about it.
And I should say here, he mentioned 2 of the 10 out of the 567 that we know something of. So he see how deceptive he is. He's right. The ethnic is a problem, and I have to come to terms with that. But you know, like if I wanna answer who are these people, I could throw my hands up in the air and say there are too many problems with the use of ethnic, or I could do something about it. And I decided to do something about it. And the fact is, as I said, the ethnic designates community of origin. It doesn't designate where this person is active, and it doesn't designate the context in which this guy performed the honors. But it gives you an indication of what they consider important, and I think this kind of creation of link between the Delians and the community of origins, even though when they honor some of them, and in one case he says the blah of blah because my memory is horrible, and Naxian, from Naxos, resident in Alexandria. So it's one of the cases says, you know, he's from Naxos, fine, but what we care about is that he's resident in Alexandria. That gives you a hint that he was there and helped out, obviously, Delians accessing Ptolemaic court, right? That's the only explanation. But there are very few cases where you can do that. I would say 10 to 12 out of 567.
So the follow-up question, are there any patterns with the pattern of honours that are granted? So some receive citizenship, but not all.
No, I looked at that. And actually, you know, like if you want to buy the book, there is a 30-page appendix all mapped out to my great, you know, like horror of completely geekness and, you know, OCD and why am I doing this, kill me now. But this is, you know, like, and I cannot see that. I cannot see that. Habicht has done work of, you know, where the citizenship designates something. No, I think it's completely random. I think the one that perhaps matters, which is Ateleia, exemption from tax, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't seem to imply anything. So yeah, no, I don't think you can do much with that. Yeah.
Well, let's continue this over some wine, and let's thank
Thank you.
Constantinople again.
Thank you.